Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Press Club. We're very pleased today to welcome back again the Treasurer, Paul Keating, one of our most regular and one of our most popular speakers. He's here today, though, not to give you some cameo impressions of last night's budget, which is his usual role about August each year, but to actually talk to you at rather greater length about consumption tax and the various factors that have influenced the decisions he'll be telling you today that have been made. He's been here often enough and is familiar enough to all of you not to need any further introduction from me, so please welcome the Treasurer, Paul Keating.
Well, thank you very much, Ken, and ladies and gentlemen. Well, I do always enjoy coming back to the Press Club, and reminds me of that point Arthur Caldwell used to make. He says after, his two rules were after, when the caucus meets after each election, be in it, which is one of his things. And he said that when the Parliament meets after each election, well, if you can be invited to the Press Club as a minister, you know you've made it. Now, I'm happy to be back, but I didn't think I'd be back so soon. And I know that, and I didn't want to be spending as much time putting down knee-jerk responses from the opposition on day one of the parliamentary sittings. But we always offer you not so much quantity but always quality. This time we're giving you quantity and quality. So you're very brave to come along and take this on a consumption tax. On a budget there's a ritual about it. And I thought today, well, I've called this thing the Phoenix, the BBCT, the broad-based consumption tax, the new one, the reincarnation, the Phoenix. And given the fact that it's going to, obviously, with the opposition, make such a splash across the sky, I thought we are probably approaching the time, given we've changed the format here, the Press Club, for a bit of strobe lighting, a bit of stagecraft and a bit of music. And I thought of calling this the Valkyrie, and somebody may believe that I've got Wagnerian obsessions as well as Napoleonic obsessions. And so I thought, well, maybe we could have the Flight of the Valkyrie overlaying the speech and get the drama, but that would only distract you and me. So you're going to have to take it cold turkey. In the past few months, the concept of a broad-based consumption tax appears to have taken on the character, as I say, of that mythical phoenix. Having incinerated itself on the funeral pyre of the tax summit, the phoenix has now apparently risen from the ashes, not only resplendent, but considerably outperforming its legendary ancestor in having acquired a host of new magical powers. The proponents of a consumption tax are insisting on creating the impression that it is a painless panacea for remedying Australia's current account difficulties by boosting national savings and relieving tax on exports. The fact of the matter is that a consumption tax cannot deliver on these objectives. As I'll explain today, the mathematics simply break down. It is not possible to introduce today a fully compensated consumption tax which yields net revenue to further reduce tax rates. Before elaborating on this point, let me first return to 1985 to remind people of the purpose a consumption tax was expected to serve in its previous incarnation. In 1984-5, as this government began its fight to turn around the Fraser spending juggernaut, Commonwealth outlays represented 30% of gross domestic product. The budget was still almost $7 billion in deficit, even though we'd begun to wind it back. The top personal marginal tax rate was 60%, company income was taxed at an effective rate of 78.4%, and we just reduced the bottom personal rate from 30% to 25%. But these high rates were applying to a very narrow base. Income taken in the form of capital gains or as fringe benefits was virtually free from tax. Tax evasion and avoidance were rife after a decade of neglect in our tax system. Hardly surprisingly, therefore, the introduction of a consumption tax was seen as a shorthand method of reducing tax rates without needing to undertake the gut-busting task of cutting outlays. The biggest argument in its favour, its fiscal yield, or dividend as we called it, which was in part the product of taxing income, which was avoiding income tax, provided much of the key to lower effective tax rates. In 1985, the savings and exports debate had no prominence. The terms of trade fall did not occur until later in that year and into 1986, renewing then the focus on the external accounts. Rather, in 1985, the consumption tax was promulgated on the basis that if we couldn't tax the income of tax avoiders when it was earned, we would at least tax it when it was spent. How different the terrain over which the phoenix flies today. The ratio of outlays to GDP now stands at 23.7%, a reduction of 6.3 percentage points in only 5 years. This takes us back to levels of government spending last experienced in the mid-1960s. At the same time, we've turned a $7 billion deficit into a surplus of greater dimension. And all of that has been achieved with no increase in the ratio of revenue to GDP. We have reduced the top marginal rate and the maximum rate on distributed corporate income, as I said before, from 87% to 47%, and the bottom rate to 21%. We have tightened up the tax system to ensure that taxpayers pay their fair share. We attack the weaknesses in the income tax system by the longhand method, expanding the tax base by wiping out rorts. The capital gains tax, the fringe benefits tax, substantiation requirements, the prescribed payment system, foreign tax credit system, and increased audit activity by the tax office have all been part of the process of expanding the tax base to provide lower tax rates. And our proposed tax haven legislation will further protect our domestic tax base. With those changes now behind us, accompanied as they were with much wailing and foreboding, is it any wonder that the shine has gone off a consumption tax? Following its rejection in 1985, the job it would have been asked to do was done the hard way by rebuilding the income tax base. That is, the community as a whole rejected a consumption tax in 1985 and demanded of government that other options to achieve lower tax rates be found. Well, they were found, and found well. The present top marginal rate of 47% compares with a rate of 50% proposed in the draft white paper option C. That is, we've got a 47% rate today without a consumption tax. The efforts of the government since 1985 in cutting the size of government in Australia means that we do now not need another major tax base to fuel another surge in Commonwealth spending at the hands of some future profligate government. It's all too easy to crank up the rate of a consumption tax by a point or two when the pressure mounts to satisfy the spending demands of some group in society or the greed of other groups who demand preferential income tax rates. Governments would too readily eschew the hard options of reordering spending priorities were such an easy means of raising revenue so readily at hand. Experience of other countries with a broad-based indirect tax suggests that there is every reason for concern on these fronts. For example, in New Zealand, the rate has already been increased as part of a fiscal rescue package, so vividly and rapidly illustrating the temptations of a major new tax base. But let us examine what the latter-day Paulian converts are now preaching. First, the Phoenix is now claimed to provide the solution to our economic difficulties by boosting the level of private savings. Even if this claim could be established, which is not clear as I shall explain, it could only be as a longer-term response years after the new tax was in place. And that is on top of any implementation lead time, some years in itself. This is confirmed by overseas experience. For example, it took New Zealand 2 years to implement its GST, and in Canada it'll be almost 4 years. Nobody should believe that a consumption tax would provide a timely response to our external debt problems. But let us look more closely at the longer-term response. A consumption tax would raise the cost of consumption if, as some of its more extreme proponents of the consumption tax have advocated, that with the end of it, national savings might rise. The increased tax revenue could be used to produce higher public sector saving. Thus, the overall savings would be increased through a tax increase. But of course, that's not the end of the story. Most proponents of a consumption tax recognise that the revenue raised by a consumption tax should be handed back to compensate for the increase in the consumer price index. Compensation means increasing social security payments and cutting personal income tax rates to ensure that real disposable incomes do not fall. It is by this latter-day means, that is, lowering marginal income tax rates, that a consumption tax is intended to boost national savings. Its objective is to cut the tax rate on savings, thus promoting more savings. However, that result is by no means clear-cut, even in the abstract. The increase in disposable income via the tax cut would also tend to add to the level of consumption, and it is a moot point whether consumption would in the end be lower or higher than previously. Economists have long argued over this point, and the evidence is available for all to see. It suggests that savings are not very responsive to changes in the after-tax rate of return. Even if we erred on the generous side of such estimates, achieving a modest increase in the level of savings would require a significant reduction in personal tax rates. That's even if we accepted the theory. It would require a significant reduction in personal tax rates. But whilst the abstract theory may be somewhat murky, the facts speak for themselves. What commentators fail to recognise today is that a consumption tax does not allow the generation of additional revenues, net of abolition of the existing sales tax to permit reductions in marginal tax rates. The money is just not there. For example, in 1990-91, a consumption tax of 12.5%, the rate proposed in 1985, would raise about $8.3 billion after the abolition of the wholesale sales tax, and would add to the level of prices by about 5%. Before any government could think about the size of the tax cuts that could be made from this amount, it would need to develop a comprehensive compensation package, particularly for those on low incomes, including those dependent on social welfare payments. Based on the draft white paper package, compensation of welfare beneficiaries would cost about $2.3 billion in today's prices. The next step would be to compensate income taxpayers to ensure no diminution in real disposable incomes following the introduction of the consumption tax. For a 12.5% consumption tax, this would involve increasing the tax-free threshold to around $7,000, reducing the bottom marginal rate to 17%, with commensurate reductions in the other marginal rates and a top rate reduction from 47% to 44%. That is a cut of 3%. Compared with the personal rate scale that applied from 1 January 1991, this would cost about $8.5 billion. On the basis of these numbers, compensating social security recipients and income taxpayers for the price effect of a 12.5% consumption tax costs $2.5 billion more than the additional indirect tax revenue raised. That is, by the time you put those two costs together, it's $2.5 billion more than that which you raise from the consumption tax. And this funding gap is even larger if you want to go further and reduce or remove the existing excises, as well as removing the wholesale sales tax, as some have advocated. What these numbers show is that in 1990, a compensated indirect tax switch cannot be accomplished in a revenue-neutral manner, let alone cover the cost of a further large reduction in marginal rates. Public saving through the budget surplus would thus decline. On any count, nobody would strenuously argue that a 3% cut in the top marginal rate would lead to any marked increase in private saving, even if it could be paid for. I mean, after all, we've already cut the top rate from 60 to 47 by 13%. And nobody is seriously suggesting there would be a positive savings response from those with incomes below the top tax threshold. That is because lower income earners typically have very little in the way of discretionary savings. They consume practically all of their income now. Indeed, some, like pensioners, are what economists call net dissavers, and would continue to do so with this change in the tax mix. It makes no difference whatsoever to this group. Whether we tax income or consumption, because the two are virtually identical. Therefore, for this group, the whole savings debate is irrelevant. The only certain impact on savings of this particular tax switch example, which I've given you, is a $2.5 billion reduction in public saving. Now, there are basically three reasons which explain why the arithmetic of 1990 differs so much from that discussed in 1985. The revenue base of the consumption tax in 1985 included a class of goods called restricted goods, which were taxed whether bought by business or consumers. You might remember that debate. It was to be a tax on everything at the one rate. Examples included petroleum products and building materials, which at the moment, of course, are not taxed. Petroleum products taxed, but not some building materials. Restricted goods were identified to overcome potential avoidance problems and the need for elaborate administrative systems to differentiate between a business and a private use. But as was recognised then, taxes on restricted goods constitute a tax on business inputs. Given that most current advocates of consumption tax wish to relieve the indirect tax impost on business inputs, a consumption tax which now included restricted goods in the base would these days be seen as entirely self-defeating. Accordingly, the consumption tax base used in the calculation I've referred to does not include restricted goods. It's therefore a smaller base than the corresponding base used in the draft white paper. The second reason for the changed arithmetic is that the wholesale sales tax has grown substantially in real terms since 1985. In 1984-5, wholesale sales tax revenue was 2.3% of GDP. This year it'll be about 2.9%. In real terms, an increase of $2.2 billion. And third, the fiscal dividend, as it was called in 1985, is not as large today. The fiscal dividend arose because there was substantial income which avoided or evaded income tax, or the income tax system. Some of this income would have been taxed by the new consumption tax when spent, but because it was outside of the income tax system, it could not receive the income tax cuts proposed in the compensation package. Because of our subsequent crackdown on tax avoidance and evasion, the cost of compensating income taxpayers has therefore increased substantially. This has, of course, naturally significantly reduced the fiscal dividend. Some will be wondering why it is that if the government were to raise additional indirect tax revenue, it would actually have to give back in compensation more than it raises. The reason for this is that a consumption tax taxes consumption and not saving. This is one of its alleged virtues. However, maintenance of real after-tax income requires compensating all income, not just that part of the income which is spent on consumption. That is, saving is also to be compensated for the increase in prices, because saving is for future consumption. For example, suppose a taxpayer has present after-tax income of $20,000, of which $2,000 is saved. A 5% increase in net consumption tax, for example, through a 12.5% consumption tax and removal of the wholesale sales tax would raise an additional $900. But since prices would go up by 5%, this taxpayer would have to receive a tax cut of $1,000 to maintain real after-tax income. Of this $1,000, $100 is to maintain the purchasing power of that taxpayer's saving, from which no consumption tax is obtained. Well, if a 12.5% consumption tax no longer works, what about the effects at other rates? Increasing the consumption tax rate to 15% would raise around $12.2 billion net of the wholesale sales tax and would increase the CPI by approximately 7%. Compensating social security recipients would cost $3.2 billion, while the cost of compensating income taxpayers would be $12 billion and would provide a top marginal rate of 43%. Hence, the funding gap for a fully compensated 15% consumption tax is $3 billion, and again without any allowance for further marginal rate reductions. Again, the net effect on national savings would certainly be negative. A 20% consumption tax produces additional indirect tax revenue of $19.9 billion, after removal of the wholesale sales tax, and an increase in the consumer price index of 10.5%, only 10.5%. Compensating social security recipients would cost $4.7 billion, whilst the cost of compensating income taxpayers would be $17 billion and would provide a top marginal rate of 41%. The budget surplus would therefore fall by $1.8 billion. Even with an absurdly high 30% consumption tax rate, the savings equation does not work. Here we would have an increase in indirect tax revenue of $35.4 billion and a CPI increase of about 18%. The cost of compensating social security beneficiaries would be $8.1 billion, and the cost of compensating income taxpayers would be $28 billion, implying a net cost to the budget of $700 million. Even after making such an implausibly large change to the tax mix, involving personal income tax cuts of $28 billion, the top margin rate would still stand at 38%. These facts will of course be difficult to swallow for the proponents of a consumption tax, particularly for the Leader of the Opposition, who has his heart set on a 30% top marginal rate. Just what consumption tax rate does Dr Hewson have in mind? As usual, the opposition is standing up for the wealthy, who because of their more privileged economic circumstances are naturally bigger savers, can demand lower income tax rates while dressing up their claims in perceived economic virtue. What the opposition will not be keen to admit is that since the distribution of savings in the economy is regressive, in other words, proportionately greater at higher income levels, any tax switch designed to boost private sector savings must also be regressive. Yet the opposition must deliver significant tax cuts at the top end of the rate scale where savings are more discretionary if it is to achieve an increase in private savings. But such tax cuts are not possible if pain is taken to compensate low-income earners for the higher cost of consumption. Perhaps the opposition and other organisations think that a government could consider introducing a consumption tax without providing adequate compensation. For example, I note that one business organisation, the Victorian Employers Federation, has circulated a consumption tax proposal which includes tables showing pensioners being made worse off. Well, let me assure you that anyone who thinks that they can get away with such a blatantly unfair tax package is sadly out of touch with reality. Some may be prepared to see low-income earners penalised by such a tax switch, but I can assure you the government is not. Clearly, Australia cannot rely on partial measures such as a consumption tax to boost our level of savings. The level of aggregate savings is likely to respond more favourably to a sustained improvement in general economic conditions and to policies targeted more specifically to longer-term savings. The real way to make savings more attractive is to do what we're doing, cutting the size of government, lowering tax rates accordingly, re-establishing superannuation and cutting the rate of inflation. Inflation is a direct tax on savings that does not apply to consumption. Reducing the hidden tax of inflation would be made even more difficult, of course, with the introduction of a consumption tax. We do not need, nor could we sustain, a 5, 7 or 10.5% boost to our price level at this time. Within the wage-fixing system, it would not be possible to ensure that the resultant pressures were absorbed, especially since there would be no scope to reduce income tax rates sufficiently to compensate for the tax switch. The likelihood is that much of the price surge would be locked into ongoing inflation. But even if the price surge were not transmitted into the ongoing rate, it would inevitably affect inflationary expectations. In terms of express policy changes to enhance national savings, this government has already done a great deal. It has developed a comprehensive retirement incomes policy for Australia for the first time in its history to provide a better standard of living in retirement and to provide long-term national savings. This policy is designed to extend the coverage of superannuation in the workforce and to encourage individuals to make greater provision for their retirement and to be less dependent on the social security system. The incentive to save for retirement through superannuation is now available to all members of the workforce. The measures we have introduced will make a positive long-term contribution to savings far outstripping the contribution that may be made from a consumption tax. Compared with 1983, we should expect to see growth in superannuation savings of around an additional 4% of GDP a year by the turn of the century, a phenomenal number. In the shorter term, the direct route to correcting the nation's savings and external imbalances is via public sector savings delivered through the Commonwealth's budget surplus. It is in these two huge areas of savings, the twin pillars of the budget surplus and superannuation, that the relevant changes will occur. And of course, they are being supported by high and sustained levels of corporate profitability and the lower tax on private savings already put in place by this government through significantly lower marginal tax rates. The last quarterly national accounts again confirm the sharp turnaround in private savings. The problem with the consumption tax phoenix is that many of its worshippers are relying on an act of faith and not on hard analysis of the costs and the benefits. They see on the horizon large cuts in the top marginal rates applying to high-income earners. But the cuts are just not available via the route of a compensated consumption tax. These people are going to have to look elsewhere for their tax cuts. It is surprising how the debate has been hijacked by the savings argument, which opportunistically exploits our current economic difficulties. As I've shown, when you look at it more closely, there is certainly no panacea there. Of course, not all who advocate a consumption tax push the pro-savings line. Some have other motives. The wholesale sales tax is frequently criticised as applying high rates to a relatively narrow base and being complex to administer because of the multiple tax rates and wide-ranging exemptions. Despite these criticisms, it is in fact a very efficient tax to administer. The administrative cost of collecting $1 of sales tax revenue is only 40% of the cost of collecting $1 of income tax revenue. Its efficiency derives from the fact that there are only about 75,000 active taxpayers in the system. By comparison, a consumption tax would probably involve a tenfold increase in registered taxpayers, which would mean higher costs of both administration and compliance. Nor is it clear by comparison with other OECD countries that Australia's tax mix is much out of line with the OECD average. The latest OECD revenue statistics show that the ratio of indirect taxes to total tax revenue in Australia was 29.8% in 1987, compared with an average for all OECD countries of 30.3%. Australia's ratio was higher than that of 6 of the 7 largest OECD countries. Indeed, the contribution of the wholesale sales tax to total taxation revenue in Australia has risen from 9.7% in 1985-86 to an estimated 11.5% this year. This growth reflects not only the strong recovery in economic growth attained by this government since coming to office, but also the results of the processes of rationalising the sales tax rate structure and removing anomalies in the system. Thus, the base has been expanded since 1985, and correspondingly, the scope for increasing revenues from a shift to a consumption tax is not as great as it was then. This is not to say that the sales tax is without its problems. The government is mindful of the limitations of the tax and has already taken steps to improve its operation. As part of the 1985 reforms, the rate scale was rationalised. Since then, the base has been broadened in various ways and some of the more anomalous exemptions have been removed. The impact of the sales tax on small business has also been recognised. In the last budget, we increased the exemption limit for small manufacturers by a factor of 4, thereby removing the need for 12,000 small manufacturers to be registered. The Commissioner of Taxation is currently looking at ways of reducing the frequency with which small business must remit collections under the wholesale sales tax system. And we do not pretend that this is the end of the matter in terms of improving equity and efficiency of the sales tax. Indeed, the Australian Taxation Office is currently considering ways of reducing complexity and uncertainty and of reducing the costs of sales tax collection, not only for the tax office but particularly for small sales tax payers. The outcome of this review should prove to be of particular benefit to taxpayers in terms of compliance with the law. On the policy side, it has been put to the government that the sales tax currently inhibits export activity through the effect of multiple taxation that can arise for manufacturers through incomplete relief for sales tax paid on inputs. The government has already addressed this issue in part with last year's budget decision to extend the aids to manufacture exemption in the sales tax law. We accept that more can be done in this area and other options are currently being examined. However, I can announce today that the government is examining ways of exempting computing equipment used in manufacturing design, estimated to cost around $100 million a year. This is expected to be of considerable benefit to a number of manufacturers engaged in sophisticated manufacturing processes, particularly with a view to export potential. Another aspect of the sales tax that has attracted commentary is its focus on goods but not services. It's been argued that a broadening of the sales tax to include services would offer the prospect of a more uniform tax treatment with lower rates applying to a wider range of transactions. Well, while the sales tax does not apply to services directly, it does so indirectly, as the inputs of goods purchased by the service sector bear tax which is not credited or refunded. The option of complementing the sales tax with a broad-based tax on services was canvassed in the context of the tax reform in 1985 and rejected because of the administrative complexity of meshing a services tax and the existing tax on goods, and because of potential avoidance problems. The problems which applied back in 1985 have not diminished since. Those who argue that it is not sufficient to remedy the perceived defects in the wholesale sales tax directly, and that it is necessary to place the entire structure with a completely new tax, have a tendency to speak as if there is a popular consensus for radical indirect tax reform. Well, I find this proposition difficult to accept. The public will naturally be suspicious of simplistic proposals which are being promoted on the basis that they are necessary for Australia's well-being. Such proposals often pay scant regard to concepts of fairness and social justice. While being advocated as providing the magic solution to our savings imbalance, what they in fact amount to is a massive shift in the tax burden to the detriment of the more needy members of society. As spelt out in the draft white paper, the change in relative tax burdens would not be confined to individuals according to their level of income. It would also have a significant effect on individuals who have accumulated even modest assets over their working lives. Retirees living off their life savings would find the purchasing power of their assets reduced by the rise in the price level, but there would be no means to compensate them for this loss. The proponents of a consumption tax, including no doubt some groups that in 1985 opposed option C, would have us believe there's now a groundswell of support, but every group is setting its own particular conditions. Some argue for a multi-stage goods and services tax with no exemptions along the lines of that in New Zealand. Others are all in favour so long as it's a single-stage retail tax. The National Farmers Federation want to abolish import duties and most of the excise on petrol, but at the same time, and not use any of the revenue for personal income tax cuts. Welfare groups have at various times wanted to exclude food and other necessities and impose capital gains tax on owner-occupied residences. I'm convinced that if you put all the so-called supporters of a consumption tax in a room now, you would go no closer to getting agreement than was the case in 1985. And there are major groups in the community, such as the elderly, who remain implacably opposed, understandably so, given the permanent loss in the purchasing power of their life savings. Just look at the experience of other countries to see the difficulties of gaining public support for a switch in the tax burden towards indirect taxation. Reform proposals in both Japan and Canada have been watered down as a result of strenuous and sustained opposition so that they can no longer involve a significant tax switch. In both cases, exemptions have been introduced, adding to the complexity of the systems and preserving many of the faults of the systems that they are replacing and were originally intended to rectify. New Zealand is the only OECD country that has managed to introduce a consumption tax with a single rate and no exemptions. But that was done, as we sought ourselves to do in 1985, as an integral component of a coherent reform package, and not as it would be now, as an isolated measure. And I note that the New Zealand Finance Minister, Mr Keating, this morning on Australian radio debunked any notion that the New Zealand GST is an effective promoter of savings and competitiveness. So in conclusion, Mr Chairman, if the principal justification for a consumption tax is to boost national savings, then the direct means presently being employed are obviously much more certain, timely and effective. We do not need to go through the disruption of introducing a consumption tax with all the risks involved to achieve that end. The government's policies in boosting public saving, reducing marginal tax rates and encouraging the spread and extent of superannuation cover are part of a broader approach directed at lifting private sector thrift in the longer term. But there are no easy fixes here. Whilst myths die hard, we need to accept that the phoenix risen from the ashes of the 1985 summit is doomed to the same fate as its predecessor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Keating. As most of you will know, Parliament awaits the Treasurer at his next stop, so he'll have to leave here in rather less than 15 minutes. Succinctness will be a greater virtue than ever in today's question period, which begins with David Barnett.
David Barnett from the Bulletin. Treasurer, you'll be, if I could, since you've dealt so completely with consumption tax, if I could switch the subject to immigration, you'll be familiar by now with the arguments that immigration requires growth to sustain employment levels, and that this growth generates a demand which is met through imports. Have you yet sought from your department an assessment of the impact of the present level of immigration on the deficit on the current account of the balance of payments? If you haven't yet sought it, will you? And if you don't intend to, why not?
Well, look, David, you know, I come to these lunches and I'm quite happy to take all the questions, as I said, cold turkey. But if I might raise a point of modest objection to the sort of gadfly approach to public issues. This has been a major issue, the consumption tax. We've had all the right-wingy type organisations and people, and I'm not quite sure, I can certainly include you in that. Whether you have actually said something about the consumption tax, I don't know. Beating a drum about this, I think you're in favour of it. We lay these issues out, invite you to come here to raise conceptual issues and questions, and you've got me darting off on another issue. I've been asked about immigration on a number of occasions in the last few weeks, and I've given my views, and I don't intend today to be ranging over that subject.
Well, Treasurer, you've just spiked a question that I was going to ask you. I won't waste your time on that. I was just wondering whether the costings you've given on the consumption tax here include all the excises. On Sunday on 10's Walsh Report, Dr Hewson gave an example there which I think excluded the excises. In other words, there was a broader revenue base than you seem to indicate here, and that did, I must say, at first blush appear more attractive than what you've managed to paint here today.
Well, this doesn't include the excises. This includes an equivalent base that we had in 1985, but not with the tax on many of those business inputs. Because the very essence of much of the argument now is that we have a de facto tax on exports through the WST. Now, in fact, the great burden of the WST's tax on inputs are on inputs in the service sector. And I believe that the tax on what one may term exports is a minor part of the revenue base of the wholesale sales tax. So we have, for the purposes of this calculation, taken the 85 base, but given the fact that the notion which we had included then, that we would tax virtually everything at a single rate and not have input exemptions, which was the catch cry, everything in and at the same rate, is now no longer acceptable to those who want to relieve the tax on exports. So we've dropped that out. It seemed to me, if you said, well, look, that makes the numbers a bit different, let's keep the base in, then you've got an argument then about the tax on inputs and why you're doing it anyway.
Julie Flynn.
Julie Flynn, Radio 2UE, Treasurer. Why did you decide that the Parliament was an inappropriate place for this exposition of government policy, and what role, if any, do you see for parliamentary debate on this issue of a consumption tax?
Well, Julie, I'm only reaffirming an election campaign commitment, one given in the public domain and reaffirmed in the public domain. This is not a change of policy and requires, therefore, no address to Parliament. But if the opposition want to be arguing this inconsistently, which is what they're doing, it is they are the people who are embarking on a policy change, and it is they who should have reserved their views for the Parliament. But they didn't. They gave it at a doorstop last week.
Paul Arnhem from the 7:30 report. Mr Keating, given what you've been able to achieve since 85 in broadening the tax base, and given what you describe as the very serious administrative and compliance problems of a consumption tax nowadays, and the other downsides that you've listed, should we now offer a prayer of thanks that back in 85 Hawke and Kelty helped to push your cart off the rails?
No, because in 1985 then, there were many conditions then which will allow a consumption tax to be introduced, and I've referred to these in the speech. A narrower tax base, a lower inflation rate. We had inflation at 5% then. And the increase in the price effect would have, had that tax summit succeeded, been discounted from the wage system. No such guarantee exists today. In fact, it wouldn't be discounted from the wage system today, not fully. Then, of course, we were looking, as I said, for a shorthand way of cutting marginal rates, because we had this narrow base, a la Howard, with very high marginal rates, 60%. What we've done is broaden the base and cut the rates. Now, we would have melded into the tax system and its bases a consumption tax which would have then existed from then on. But when that was denied to us, to me, I went the longhand approach. That is, broaden the tax base, and then obviously as we cut Commonwealth spending, the revenue needed to maintain the given level of public expenditure was of course less, because the public sector we were financing was smaller. So in other words, the consumption tax then was not about savings and exports. It was about how do you get marginal rate, how do you get these absurdly high marginal rates down. And this was the way to do it, and to tax some of the black economy, to bring income to tax. We've brought much income to tax by now expanding the tax base through capital gains, fringe benefits, substantiation, prescribed payments. And because the tax base is now bigger, it costs more money to compensate it. That's why the compensatory packages are much more expensive. That's why the numbers today are not then. I mean, you can replace the wholesale sales tax today with a consumption tax at a single rate. And you can argue about the efficiency of that, but you can't get tax cuts from it. You understand? You can't get tax cuts from it. You can replace it at a single rate, but you can't get tax cuts from it. And I don't think that it is an idea at all now to be giving this boost to the price level to set up the enormous machinery of a consumption tax with all of the problems of compensation and fairness and savings and the rest, and assets, effects on assets, to simply have a switch from the WST, which, as I say, is a relatively efficient tax anyway, to a consumption tax. Because most of the goods in the WST are taxed at a single rate anyway, 20%. The great bulk of it's at 20%.
Tom Connors.
Sorry, Tom Connors, Canberra Times, Treasurer. You've presented a wide range of reasons why the consumption tax should not be introduced in Australia. But overseas, it seems to be expanding and increasing in the OECD countries. Is there circumstances in those countries that make it work, or are they on the wrong track?
They're financing in the main bigger public sectors, Tom. They've got another tax base financing a bigger public sector. Europe went down the road of value-added taxes and sought to provide lower marginal rates as a result. We've gone down the route of providing, remember this, we've got a lower marginal rate today, 47, than was proposed with option C and a 12.5% consumption tax in 1985, which was 50. I mean, the proof of the pudding's in the eating. I'm not making a claim, I'm stating a fact. 47 is in the slot now, with no consumption tax. So what is the virtue of going out and saying, well, everyone now should pay 15% or 20%, whatever, on their Wheaties, their shoes, their clothing, that the elderly, who are not savers but who are dissavers, who are running their life savings down, should cop it with a 12 or 15% increase in everything they buy? I mean, what is the actual... I mean, everyone's now finding tremendous virtue in setting up a new tax. I mean, Tucky was right about one thing. The Liberal Party, in its first statement, its first utterance on policy is to embrace a new tax.
Steve Burrell.
Steve Burrell, Financial Review. Mr Keating. The figures you've presented today suggest that the magic pudding of revenue available in 1985 certainly isn't there now, and the wheels have well and truly fallen off that cart. Why not build a better cart? Why not consider an expenditure tax approach, which has many of the advantages of the consumption tax without many of the significant disadvantages, including an inflationary boost, the need to compensate people for that change, and various other anomalies and problems you've identified today?
Well, I take this as this question designed for you, Steve, as an advert for you in your column during the week, where you put it up and then knocked it over. And I just say, well, job well done. You know, you did put it up and you did knock it over. And if you're looking with a question for praise from me, you have it. You have it. Well, the problem is you've got it closely to... I mean, basically, with an expenditure tax, you're effectively giving a tax credit for an income tax credit for saving. And you've got to closely define saving and expenditure. And that's a very difficult thing to do administratively. And then you've got to decide to do what you do about all the lumpy expenditures. Do you average them out over a period of time? And what do you do with people who accumulate savings in Australia but then spend them overseas? I mean, do they get a free kick? So, you know, I mean, that's why when you travel around the international tax landscape, you don't see expenditure taxes anywhere. I mean, there's a lot of literature on it. The British looked at it in the 1970s and turned it down. And because I say that's all I intend to say about it. I'm not going to chase around the landscape about an expenditure tax. I mean, some idea drops into the landscape, and I've got to then spend a week of my time getting a speech together to say why it's no good. So I don't intend to be everybody's research officer.
Well, Mr Keating, we recognise the demands on your time today and the pressures of Parliament. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Ken.
In the past, we've given you a number of personalised, customised tyres. Something different today. As usual, your wife Anita is with you here today. We'd like to present this silk scarf to you for her, but no less our thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure she'll be very pleased. Well, just for a moment, mate.